The deep blue state of Maryland might actually be electing a Republican senator soon. But how? In today's video, we will find out. Now, in the Maryland Senate polling right now on Real Clear Politics, Larry Hogan, the Republican former governor of the state of Maryland, a Republican, leads Democrat Angela Alsobrooks by 6.5%, a big warning sign for the Democratic Party in this traditionally very blue state. For context here, Joe Biden won the state by more than 1 million votes. The state voted for Joe Biden by 33.2% over Donald Trump. You can just look at the county map here. All the major population centers went blue, while on the red counties are super sparsely populated. However, this race could be very, very competitive and could technically end up going red. So in today's video, we're going to be exploring the Maryland Senate race, how this race could end up going red for Larry Hogan. Now, first off, why is Larry Hogan such a strong candidate in such a blue state? We can trace it back to 2018 governor's race, where Larry Hogan, the Republican incumbent governor of the state of Maryland, in a D+33 state, defeated Democrat Ben Jealous by a margin of 12%, which by my characterizations would be a safe margin, and won the race by more than 273,000 votes. In fact, the Democrat only carried 4 of the counties in the state of Maryland, while Larry Hogan carried all of the remaining counties. In fact, it was a blowout for Larry Hogan. I'm going to take an example. For example, Montgomery County, a county that voted for Ben Jealous, the Democrat, by 10 points. Guess what it voted for Joe Biden by? Biden won the county by 60%, and yet Larry Hogan only lost the county by 10. That is a 50-point swing. We go to nearby Fredericks County here. Larry Hogan won this county by 36 points as a Republican, but Joe Biden won the county by 10 points as a Democrat. Again, we see a 46% swing, and that swing is consistent across the state. We go to Howard County, a county that Biden won by 44%, was also a county that Larry Hogan carried by 14%. Very populated county. This is a 55% swing towards Larry Hogan. Larry Hogan is a historic overperformer, where in many of the New England states, there are liberal Republican governors in deep blue states, because these voters, they like Democrats. They consistently vote Democratic before the governor races. Sometimes they do end up opting for a Republican who they believe, is more liberal, and that they're actually happy to vote for Republicans. And Larry Hogan right now, at least, is polling quite well. Now, another problem for the Democratic Party here is who they nominated. So essentially, David Trone was the favorite going into this race to be the Democratic nominee for Senate, and that was a good thing. Why was that a good thing? If you look at the 2024, we go to the Democratic primary here between Angela Alsobrooks and David Trone. David Trone raised $54 million. And $54 million, pretty much all of it was self-funded. David Trone is the founder of a very, very large and very, very profitable wine company, and essentially he fundraised $54 million for himself. That is a significant sum that could have been used on fundraising, on advertisements against Larry Hogan, portraying him as a Republican, portraying Larry Hogan as someone who does not represent the Democratic base of Maryland. Instead, Angela Alsobrooks ended up picking up the upset against David Trone, and Angela Alsobrooks is the more progressive candidate, and generally you do not want the more progressive candidate over the more establishmentarian candidate in a race that, again, where the opposition candidate is pretty liberal. You generally want to position yourself in the middle so that you can say, look, as if you're a Democrat, if you historically vote Democratic, I'm not that far off from the guy that you might have voted for the governor's race. And essentially, you can be buying the argument that if the two of them are positioned similarly, you're generally going to back the guy who you support in terms of the party. So in that case, it would be David Trone. But if you're a generic Democrat and you see, okay, on one hand, I could vote for a Republican called Larry Hogan, who is more liberal and fits with my values. On the other hand, I'm going to be voting for Angela Alsobrooks, who fits with my party, but not necessarily with my political agenda. They might end up backing Larry Hogan. So really, David Trone could have probably been the better candidate. I know you can argue that Angela Alsobrooks might be able to turn out more voters, but I believe that argument is more invalid because this is a presidential race. Generally, in presidential races, when we have competitive races, on the House level, state Senate, state House level, voters are going to come out and vote regardless if they really want to vote for a Senate race. They just want to vote for president and perhaps a down ballot competitive race in their local election. Instead, what we're seeing here is that Angela Alsobrooks won the primary, and now voters who may have pretty much backed Trone are now considering, am I actually going to vote for a Democrat? And this is not just theory or speculation. This is pretty consistent according to polling. You can see that in the 4 polls taken, David Trone consistently does better than Angela Alsobrooks. And essentially, Trone, he had the money, he could have spent it. He made sure he was going to win the Senate race. And now Angela Alsobrooks, sure, she does fundraise a bit better than David Trone, but still, right? Trone had all the money he wanted to end up fundraising this race, and now that money, do you think that David Trone's going to give $54 million to Angela Alsobrooks, to someone who he ended up losing to in a Democratic primary? Of course not. And now Alsobrooks also has a problem on the money side of things, because Larry Hogan has actually fundraised a substantial amount of money in his in his race. Essentially, Larry Hogan has also fundraised tens of millions of dollars. We're going to look at this. You can see that Larry Hogan, he has fundraised $3 million to end up running this campaign, and he's also a pretty strong fundraiser, right? And also, if we look at the primary, there's another problem for the Democratic Party, essentially. It's the fact that this primary was a lot closer than the Republican primary. You can't really draw much out of that, but still, Larry Hogan had a much better race than Angela Alsobrooks in her race. Now, the next thing we're going to be looking at is pretty much just the Wikipedia page, because the Wikipedia page tells us some concerns for the Democratic Party in this race. Essentially, what we're seeing here is pretty much the generic things. If you look at the predictions, sure, this is a likely or safe Democratic race. But if you're actually looking at some of the analysis, some of these things, it does look a bit better for Larry Hogan. And Angela Alsobrooks has indeed taken a lead in the 2 more recent polls, but Larry Hogan held substantial leads. And right now, even with this race pretty much going towards Angela Alsobrooks in her direction, it still does look like that Larry Hogan still has a substantial amount of support. And right now, I'm just going to stress here, I don't actually believe that Larry Hogan will end up winning this race. I believe Angela Alsobrooks will end up winning. But the thing is, this race, I believe, will be a lot closer than much of what the media does predict right now. I believe that this race will be probably going to Angela Alsobrooks right now, at least by about 5%, which is not great considering Joe Biden won the state by 33%, the second bluest, essentially, state in the United States, just behind the state of Vermont. Now, I just do want to stress some cautionary notes here for the Republican primary by looking at 2 past examples, the state of Montana between Steve Daines and Steve Bullock, and the state of Tennessee between Marsha Blackburn and Phil Bredesen. These were 2 very popular Democratic governors of the state. I'm just going to show you Phil Bredesen, for example. If you look at his 2008, his second term, in his elections, essentially, he was able to win by 40 percentage points as a re-election as the governor. In his second term, he won by 40%, which is, again, just absolutely crazy. However, when we're looking at this election, essentially, it's not great, right? It's although Phil Bredesen had a 40% lead in essentially his governor's race, he still lost by 10%. And again, this race polling-wise was still extremely competitive. We could be seeing the Maryland Senate race heading in the same direction as the Tennessee Senate race back in 2018, where Phil Bredesen was an extremely popular Democrat who, again, ran a very solid campaign, demonstrated himself as a conservative Democrat, someone who was willing to compromise with Republicans, someone who originally actually had a polling lead in many of the polls, but again, if you the big difference here between Maryland and Tennessee is the fact that Marsha Blackburn was actually leading in the polls by several percent over Phil Bredesen, and Phil Bredesen essentially underperformed the polling by about 5% against Marsha Blackburn. Blackburn was expected to win by about 5, but instead she ended up winning by about 10%. But here's the thing, Larry Hogan, the Republican, the opposition candidate, is right now leading by 6.5% over Angela Alsobrooks. So in theory, if Hogan does about 5% worse than what the polls predict, he still ends up winning. Now, again, I'm not going to say it's strictly 5% because there's another example. In 2020, Steve Bullock and Steve Daines ran a very competitive campaign. Again, Steve Daines was only expected to win by about 1 to 2%, and the Republican incumbent ended up winning by 10%. So you do see that there is a possibility, and I do believe that Hogan will underperform the polls. And right now, I still do believe that Angela Alsobrooks would end up defeating Larry Hogan in this race. But I'm just saying this race could be very interesting to watch, and it could actually come down to a wire. Although I do expect Alsobrooks to win, this race is still very interesting. It's a race that could be unexpectedly close, and technically Larry Hogan still has a realistic shot of winning the state, though it does look slim. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.